I grew up as the invisible child in my family, ignored, overlooked, and forgotten. Years later, I finally broke free, found my voice, and built the loving home I always deserved. I never thought that growing up in my own family would feel like constantly standing in the shadows, watching someone else soak up all the light. From the outside, we probably looked like an ordinary household. A mother, a father, 2 children. Neighbors would smile and wave, thinking we were a picture-perfect family. But if you stepped inside, if you listened closely to the way conversations unfolded, if you saw who received the hugs, the praise, the gifts, and who quietly sat there unnoticed, you would realize the truth. One of us mattered more, and it was never me. When I was a child, I tried to convince myself that love in a family couldn't possibly run out, that there was enough to go around, like air or sunshine, but it didn't take long to see the pattern. My younger sister, Lily, was the center of everything. From the moment she was born, my parents looked at her like she was a miracle. Don't get me wrong, I loved her too. I was just a kid when she arrived, and I remember feeling excited to be an older sibling. I thought I would get to teach her things, guide her, maybe even protect her. Instead, I slowly realized that she didn't need my protection, she already had all of theirs. At birthdays, she received elaborate cakes with decorations shaped like cartoon characters she adored. My own birthdays? A simple store-bought cake, sometimes with my name even misspelled on top. When she brought home drawings from kindergarten, they ended up framed on the living room wall. My achievements, honor roll certificates, medals from school competitions would disappear into a drawer somewhere, never mentioned again. It sounds small, doesn't it? Just cakes and drawings, but it was never just about those things. It was about the message. She matters more, you matter less. At first, I tried harder. I thought maybe if I was perfect, if I excelled in every way, they would see me. So I threw myself into schoolwork, sports, music lessons, anything that might spark a proud smile from them. But no matter what I did, Lily outshined me. Or rather, my parents made sure she did. If I came home with an A, they would say, "Good job." If she came home with a gold star sticker, they would cheer like she had just won an Olympic medal. And over time, I stopped trying to compete. Because what's the point of climbing a mountain if you know the peak will always belong to someone else? Still, the thing that hurt the most wasn't the presents or the praise. It was the silence. My parents never asked me how I was feeling, what I wanted, or what I dreamed of becoming. At the dinner table, the conversation revolved around Lily, her friends, her teachers, her hobbies. I was there, chewing quietly, sometimes adding a comment, but most of the time it was like my voice didn't even register. Imagine sitting in a room full of people you love, and yet feeling invisible. That was my childhood. One memory sticks out more sharply than the rest. I must have been about 12 years old. I had worked for weeks on a science fair project, building a model of the solar system with moving parts powered by a tiny motor. I was proud of it, not just because it worked, but because I had done it almost entirely on my own. On the day of the fair, my parents came. I thought maybe this time they would finally see me. They walked around, glanced at my project, and said, "That's nice." Then they hurried across the room to watch Lily recite a short poem for her class. She stumbled over the words, forgetting lines, but they applauded like she had given a performance worthy of Broadway. I stood there beside my spinning planets, my chest aching, realizing that no matter what I did, I would never be their star. Years went by like this. The gap widened. I became quieter, more withdrawn, while Lily flourished under their constant attention. Teachers noticed, friends noticed. Some even asked me if I was jealous. I laughed it off, pretending it didn't bother me. But at night, lying awake, I would think, why not me? Why am I not enough? When I became a teenager, things got more complicated. That's when the word niche started floating around in my head. Not in the way YouTubers use it now, to describe a content category, but in the sense of a role, a space where you belong. Lily's niche in the family was obvious. The golden child, the princess, the miracle. My niche? I wasn't sure. Maybe the background character. Maybe the extra. I started to wonder if every family unconsciously assigns roles to their kids. One becomes the favorite, one the rebel, one the caretaker. And once those roles are set, breaking free feels impossible. By the time I reached my final year of high school, I had stopped expecting recognition. I focused on my own plans, college applications, dreams of independence, imagining a life where I didn't have to fight for scraps of attention. But even then, even as an almost adult, the sting of neglect lingered. It wasn't about needing constant praise anymore. It was about wanting basic acknowledgement that I mattered too. I'll never forget the night of my graduation ceremony. I had earned honors, and I was supposed to walk across the stage to receive my diploma. I looked into the audience, searching for my parents' faces. And yes, they were there. But they weren't watching me. They were fussing over Lily, adjusting her dress, taking pictures of her while she sat in the bleachers. When my name was called, I crossed the stage, shook hands with the principal, and looked out again, only to realize their eyes weren't even on me. That was the moment something inside me cracked. You see, the neglect doesn't just hurt in the moment, it leaves scars. It shapes the way you see yourself, the way you form relationships, the way you trust or don't trust others. I carried those scars with me, pretending they didn't exist, pretending I was strong enough to move past them. But deep down, I was still that kid at the science fair, standing beside the spinning planets, waiting for someone to notice. And that brings me to the part of my story I never shared with anyone until now, how it all reached its breaking point, and how I finally decided I couldn't keep living as the invisible child. The breaking point didn't arrive with a dramatic explosion. It came quietly, the way a crack slowly spreads across glass until one day, with the slightest touch, the whole thing shatters. After graduation, I carried that moment of being overlooked like a stone in my pocket, heavy, impossible to ignore. I told myself that moving away for college would fix everything. Distance, I thought, would heal wounds. New people would see me differently. Without my family hovering in the background, I might finally learn who I was outside the role they assigned me. And at first, it did feel like freedom. Walking onto a campus where no one knew my history was exhilarating. I could be whoever I wanted. I didn't have to compete with Lily. I didn't have to wonder whether my parents noticed me. In a way, I carved out a brand new niche for myself. Not the invisible child, not the background character, but the independent adult who made choices on their own terms. But the truth about childhood scars is that they don't vanish just because you change locations. They live in your habits, your fears, your voice when you doubt yourself. And mine showed up in the strangest places. For example, in group projects, I rarely spoke up. I would let others take the lead, even when I had good ideas. I was terrified that if I demanded attention, people would roll their eyes the way my parents used to when I asked for recognition. In friendships, I overextended myself, always trying to please, always putting others first, because deep down, I believed my own needs weren't as important. And in relationships, that was the hardest part. I found myself drawn to people who treated me with the same indifference I had known all my life. It felt familiar, almost comfortable, even though it hurt. It wasn't until I met Daniel that things began to shift. He was nothing like the people I usually surrounded myself with. Where I expected dismissal, he gave attention. Where I braced for criticism, he offered encouragement. At first, I didn't know what to do with that. I waited for the other shoe to drop, for him to lose interest, for him to prove that I was forgettable. But he didn't. Instead, he stayed. One night, as we sat under the stars after a long walk, he said something that struck me deeply. "You don't realize how often you make yourself small," he told me. "Like you're afraid to take up space." I wanted to deny it. I wanted to laugh it off. But instead, tears filled my eyes. Because he was right. I had been shrinking myself for years, trying to avoid disappointment, trying to blend into the background where it felt safer. And hearing him say it out loud made me realize how much I had internalized the role my family had given me. That was when I started to confront my past more seriously. For years, I had avoided looking too closely at the pain. I thought ignoring it was the same as overcoming it. But Daniel made me realize that healing required acknowledgement. So I began journaling, writing down every memory I could recall, the birthdays where I was forgotten, the conversations where I was ignored, the graduations where I was invisible. It was painful, reliving those moments. Sometimes I would cry so hard I couldn't keep writing. But strangely, putting it on paper gave me clarity. It turned vague feelings of inadequacy into concrete experiences. And once I could see them clearly, I could start to challenge the lies they had planted in me. One lie in particular haunted me. The belief that I wasn't enough. Not smart enough, not interesting enough, not lovable enough. But as I looked back, I realized that belief didn't come from me. It was given to me, planted in me by the way my parents treated me. And if it had been given, maybe it could also be returned. Maybe it didn't have to define me forever. Still, confronting the past didn't mean the present was easy. Holidays were especially tough. I remember the first Thanksgiving break when I came home from college. I walked in with excitement, hoping maybe things would be different now that I was older. But within minutes, I saw the same old pattern. My parents asked Lily about her classes, her friends, her hobbies. They barely glanced at me. I sat there, sipping water, feeling the familiar ache of invisibility. That night, I almost broke down in my old bedroom. But then Daniel called. He asked how dinner went, and when I told him the truth, he said, "You can't keep expecting them to change, but you can change how much power you give them." At first, that sounded harsh. Wasn't it natural to want your parents to love you equally? Wasn't it their responsibility to treat their children with fairness? But as I sat with his words, I realized what he meant. I had been waiting my whole life for my parents to see me. What if they never did? Was I willing to waste the rest of my life waiting for something that might never come? The idea scared me, but it also freed me, because it meant I didn't have to keep living in their shadow. I could choose to step into my own light, even if they never offered it to me. That decision wasn't a single moment. It was a gradual process, like peeling away layers of an old, tight skin. I started small. In conversations, I forced myself to speak up, even when my voice shook. In friendships, I began setting boundaries instead of always sacrificing my own needs. And in my relationship with Daniel, I practiced accepting love without suspicion, reminding myself that I deserved it. Of course, there were setbacks. There were days I slipped back into old patterns, shrinking myself, staying quiet, doubting my worth. But each time, I tried again. Healing, I realized, isn't about never falling, it's about standing back up each time you do. The real test came years later, on another milestone day of my life, my wedding. By then, I had grown stronger, more confident. I had learned to create a family of choice with people who valued me. But as the wedding approached, the question loomed, would my parents show up for me this time? Would they treat my day as mine, or would they once again shift the spotlight to Lily? In the weeks leading up, I found myself torn. Part of me wanted to invite them, hoping against hope that maybe, just maybe, they would finally recognize me. Another part of me dreaded it, fearing that their presence would taint what should be the happiest day of my life. After sleepless nights and long talks with Daniel, I decided to invite them. Not because I expected them to change, but because I wanted to give myself closure. I wanted to say, I had done my part. When the day finally came, everything was beautiful. The flowers, the music, the vows Daniel and I exchanged. But as I looked around the room, I saw the inevitable. My parents were there, but their attention was not on me. They fussed over Lily's outfit, introduced her to guests as if she were the star, and even left early, saying she was tired. For a moment, my chest clenched with that old, familiar ache. The invisible child inside me cried out, "Not again, not today." But then I turned to Daniel, who squeezed my hand, his eyes filled with love and pride. And in that instant, I understood something profound. My parents' neglect did not define me anymore. Their inability to see me didn't erase the truth of who I was. I was a partner, a friend, a person worthy of love and recognition. And I didn't need their validation to prove it. That realization was both heartbreaking and liberating. Heartbreaking because it confirmed what I had always feared. They might never change. Liberating because it meant I was finally free. Free to stop chasing their approval. Free to build a life where I mattered. From that day forward, I carried myself differently. Not perfectly, not without insecurity, but with a deeper sense of self-worth. I poured my energy into relationships that lifted me up instead of tearing me down. I pursued passions that brought me joy. I allowed myself to take up space, to speak, to shine. And most importantly, I promised myself something. When the day came that I had children of my own, I would never let them feel invisible. I would never repeat the cycle. I would make sure each of them knew they mattered, not for what they accomplished, not for how they compared to one another, but simply because they were mine. Because every child deserves that. Every child deserves to be seen. When I think back on my childhood now, it almost feels like watching a film in which I played a minor role. The scenes flicker across my memory. The dinners where my parents laughed with Lily while I sat silent. The vacations where her needs dictated every decision. The milestones that slipped past without acknowledgement. For years, I thought those memories defined me. I thought they were proof that I wasn't enough, that I was destined to stay invisible forever. But here's the thing I've learned as I've grown older. Our past shapes us, yes, but it doesn't have to imprison us. The challenge is learning how to take those painful experiences and transform them into lessons, into fuel, into something that guides us instead of chains us. That transformation didn't happen overnight. After the wedding, after finally confronting the truth that my parents might never change, I went through a period of grief. That might sound strange, grieving for parents who were still alive, still part of my life. But I wasn't grieving their deaths. I was grieving the fantasy of the parents I wished I had. You see, for so long I clung to hope. Hope that one day they would wake up and realize how much they had hurt me. Hope that they would apologize, make amends, and finally treat me like their child instead of a background character in Lily's story. Letting go of that hope felt like tearing out a piece of myself. But it was necessary. Because as long as I held on to it, I was stuck in limbo, half in the past, half in the present, unable to move forward. Grieving gave me clarity. It allowed me to see my parents not as mythical figures whose love I had to earn, but as flawed humans with their own limitations. Did that excuse the way they treated me? No, but it helped me stop taking their neglect as proof of my own inadequacy. Their favoritism was about them, not me. Still, healing is rarely a straight line. There were nights when anger bubbled up so fiercely I could barely sleep. I would replay conversations in my head, thinking of all the things I wished I had said, all the times I should have stood up for myself. Other nights, sadness took over, and I would cry quietly into my pillow, mourning the childhood I never got to fully have. But in between those waves of anger and sadness, something else began to grow. Determination. Determination to create a different kind of life for myself. Determination to break the cycle. I started by seeking therapy. For years, I had resisted the idea, telling myself I could handle it on my own. But therapy gave me something I had never truly experienced before, a space where my feelings were valid. My therapist didn't minimize my experiences or shift the focus to someone else. She looked me in the eye and said, "What you went through matters. You matter." And hearing those words was like water to a parched soul. Through therapy, I learned to recognize patterns, like how I often downplayed my achievements because I expected others to dismiss them, or how I struggled to accept compliments, brushing them off because deep down, I didn't believe they were true. Slowly, I began to challenge those habits. When someone praised me, I practiced saying, "Thank you," instead of immediately deflecting. When I accomplished something, I allowed myself to celebrate, even if no one else did. It felt awkward at first, almost like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. But over time, those new behaviors started to feel natural. They became part of the new identity I was building, an identity no longer tethered to invisibility. One of the most profound changes came when I became an aunt. Lily had children of her own before I did, and though my relationship with her was complicated, I adored her kids. Every time I visited, I made sure to look them in the eyes, to listen to their stories, to celebrate their small victories. I wanted them to feel what I never did, that their presence alone was enough, that they were seen, heard, and loved. Ironically, spending time with them also revealed the subtle ways favoritism seeps into families. Even Lily, who had grown up as the golden child, sometimes leaned toward one child more than the other without realizing it. She would laugh louder at one's jokes, praise one's grades more enthusiastically, spend more time with one than the other. I noticed because I had lived it, and gently, without judgment, I would remind her to balance her attention, to make sure both children felt equally valued. Sometimes she listened, sometimes she didn't. But each time, I felt a renewed commitment to the promise I had made myself, to never let a child in my care feel invisible. Eventually, Daniel and I had children of our own, and that, more than anything, became the ultimate test. Because it's one thing to say you'll break the cycle, it's another thing to actually do it. Parenting is hard, and it's easy to slip into old habits. There were days when one child demanded more attention, when exhaustion tempted me to overlook the quieter one. But in those moments, I remembered my own childhood. I remembered the sting of sitting at the dinner table, ignored. I remembered the ache of crossing the graduation stage unseen, and those memories jolted me back to awareness. So I made conscious choices. I set aside one-on-one time with each child, no matter how busy life became. I praised effort, not just results, so they knew their worth wasn't tied to performance. I encouraged them to pursue their own passions, even if they didn't align with my expectations. And perhaps most importantly, I listened, truly listened when they spoke. Because sometimes, the greatest gift you can give a child is not material things, but the assurance that their voice matters. Of course, I wasn't a perfect parent, no one is. But perfection was never the goal. The goal was presence. The goal was to make sure my children never doubted, even for a second, that they were loved and valued equally. Looking back now, I can see how my painful beginnings shaped the parent I became. They taught me empathy, patience, and awareness. They showed me what not to do, and in that sense, they gave me a blueprint for what I should do instead. In a strange way, my invisibility became a teacher. And here's the truth I want anyone listening to remember. Your childhood does not have to define your destiny. Maybe you grew up in a family where you were overlooked, where someone else always came first, where you felt like you didn't belong. That pain is real, and it matters. But it doesn't mean you're doomed to repeat the cycle. You have the power to create a new story for yourself, and for the generations that come after you. Sometimes I imagine sitting across from my younger self, that little kid at the science fair with the spinning planets. I would take their hands and say, "You are enough. You always were. Their failure to see you does not erase your light." And I like to think that if that child could hear me, they would stand a little taller, smile a little wider, and believe in themselves just a little more. Because in the end, that's what healing is all about, not erasing the past, but rewriting the meaning it holds for us. It's strange how childhood doesn't end when you grow up. The calendar flips, the years stack up, and suddenly you're in your 30s with a career, a partner, maybe even children of your own. But those early lessons, the ones carved into you by your family, don't simply vanish. They echo in the choices you make, the risks you avoid, the way you see yourself in the mirror. For me, the echo was always the same. Stay small, don't expect too much, don't believe you matter as much as others do. I carried that message like an invisible script, one I didn't even realize I was following until much later. When I started my first job out of college, I thought I had left all that behind. I entered the office, determined to prove myself. I stayed late, volunteered for projects no one else wanted, and bent over backwards to make my boss happy. My work ethic was strong, but underneath it was desperation, the same desperation that had once driven me to build solar systems out of cardboard and motors, hoping my parents would finally notice. Only this time, it wasn't about my family. It was about colleagues, managers, anyone who could offer me the recognition I still craved. The trouble was, when you're always trying to prove your worth, people notice, and not in a good way. Some saw me as reliable, sure, but others saw me as someone they could exploit. I became the go-to person for grunt work, the one expected to pick up the slack, the one who wouldn't complain. And because I feared letting people down, I let it happen. It wasn't until my third year at that job that I hit another breaking point. I had worked myself into exhaustion preparing a major report. I poured weeks into it, even missing social events and neglecting my own health. When the presentation day came, I sat in the conference room as my boss flipped through the slides I had created. He smiled, praised the work, and then turned to a colleague of mine and said, "Great job putting this together." My chest went hollow. My name wasn't mentioned once. I had done the work, but someone else received the credit. And as everyone clapped, I sat there, invisible again. That night, I went home and stared at the ceiling for hours. It was the same story, all over again. Different setting, different people, but the same feeling. Unseen, unacknowledged. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just bad luck. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was a pattern. I was recreating my childhood in my adult life, over and over again. Why? Because deep down, I still believed invisibility was my niche. I didn't know how to step out of it. Realizing that hurt. But it also gave me power. Because if I was the one carrying the script, maybe I could rewrite it. So I started small. The next time someone overlooked my contribution, I spoke up not angrily, not defensively, but clearly. "Actually, I worked on that part of the project," I said. My voice shook, my palms sweated, but I forced the words out. And you know what? No one mocked me. No one rolled their eyes. They just nodded. It was that simple. It wasn't about becoming arrogant or demanding constant praise. It was about giving myself permission to exist fully, to take up space, to be recognized when I deserved it. And little by little, I got better at it. But the workplace wasn't the only arena where the past haunted me. Friendships carried their own challenges. Because when you grow up unseen, you often learn to measure your worth by what you can give. I was the friend who remembered birthdays, who stayed up late listening to problems, who drove across town at midnight to help someone in need. And while some friends appreciated that, others took advantage. There were times when I felt drained, like I was pouring everything into relationships but receiving little in return. Yet I stayed, because walking away felt like confirming the old fear, that I wasn't worth keeping around. One day, Daniel noticed. He asked me why I kept bending over backwards for people who barely showed up for me. I shrugged and said, "That's just who I am." But later, I realized that wasn't true. It wasn't who I was. It was who I had been trained to be. A child desperate for scraps of attention. So I began practicing something new. Boundaries. It felt terrifying at first. Saying no felt like I was risking abandonment. But each time I did, I discovered something surprising. Real friends stayed. They respected my limits. It was only the ones who didn't truly care who drifted away. And as painful as that was, it was also cleansing. My circle grew smaller, but it grew healthier too. This journey of unlearning and relearning spilled into every corner of my life, even into how I saw myself in the mirror. For years, I carried an inner critic that sounded suspiciously like my parents. Whenever I made a mistake, that voice sneered, "See, you're not good enough. You'll never measure up." But one day, while journaling, I asked myself, if I spoke to my children the way I spoke to myself, what would happen? The thought horrified me. I would never tell them they weren't enough. I would never diminish their worth. So why was I doing it to me? That question changed everything. Slowly, I began replacing that cruel inner voice with a kinder one. It wasn't easy. Old habits die hard. But whenever the critic whispered, I countered with something new. I am enough. I deserve love. I deserve to be seen. And the more I practiced, the more natural it became. I won't pretend it was a straight climb upward. Healing rarely is. Some days I felt strong and confident. Other days I fell back into old doubts. But over time, I noticed the balance shifting. The invisible child was still there, but they no longer ran the show. Perhaps the most powerful moment of this transformation came during a family reunion. My parents were there, of course, still doting on Lily, still barely acknowledging me. Normally, that would have crushed me. But this time, something felt different. I no longer needed their validation. I had built my own sense of worth, brick by brick, through therapy, through boundaries, through self-compassion. So when my parents once again praised Lily while ignoring my achievements, I smiled. Not out of acceptance of their behavior, but out of recognition of my own growth. For the first time, their neglect didn't define me. It revealed them, not me. And in that moment, I felt something I had never felt before: peace. Becoming a parent was the most terrifying and beautiful experience of my life. Terrifying, because I was carrying the weight of my past and the fear of repeating it. Beautiful, because for the first time, I had the chance to rewrite the story from the very beginning. I remember holding my first child in my arms, their tiny fingers curling around mine, their eyes blinking open like they were meeting the world for the first time. In that moment, I made a silent vow: you will never feel invisible, not for a second. I see you. I will always see you. But promises are easy when the baby is sleeping peacefully in your arms. The real test comes at 3 a.m. when the crying won't stop, when exhaustion gnaws at your patience, when work deadlines pile up, and you're stretched so thin you feel like breaking. That's when old patterns creep back in, whispering the same toxic lines. One child matters more. There isn't enough love to go around. Someone will be left behind. I fought those whispers daily. I fought them with presence. Every night, no matter how tired I was, I sang to my child. I told them I loved them, even when they couldn't understand the words. When they grew older and their sibling was born, I doubled my effort, making sure neither one felt overshadowed. If one showed me a drawing, I praised it. If the other told me a story, I listened closely, even if I was distracted. Because here's the truth I had learned through pain: children remember. They remember who listened and who didn't. They remember who celebrated their small victories and who brushed them aside. They remember whether they mattered. I wanted my children's memories to be different from mine. Of course, that didn't mean it was easy. Sibling rivalry is a natural part of growing up, and there were times when one child accused me of loving the other more. Those moments cut deep because they mirrored the very wounds I carried. I worried constantly. Am I failing? Am I creating another version of me, desperate for attention? But instead of letting that fear control me, I leaned into honesty. I told my children directly, I love you both. I may spend more time with one of you today because of homework or activities, but that doesn't mean I love the other any less. My love isn't a pie that runs out when someone takes a slice. It's infinite. Sometimes they believed me, sometimes they didn't. But the important thing was that I said it. I named it out loud. Because the silence I grew up with, was what made invisibility so painful. One evening stands out in my memory. My eldest had come home upset after losing a soccer game. They sat in their room, sulking, refusing to talk. Meanwhile, my youngest burst in, waving a painting they had done in art class. For a split second I froze. How could I give both children the attention they needed at the same time? So I knelt down with the youngest, admired their painting, and said, I'm so proud of you. Can you hang it up on the fridge while I check on your sibling? Then I went into the other room, sat quietly beside my eldest, and waited. Eventually they opened up. They admitted they felt like a failure, like nothing they did mattered, and my heart broke, because I recognized those words as echoes of my own childhood. I told them something I wish someone had told me when I was their age. You don't have to win to matter. You matter because you're you. Losing a game doesn't change that. Nothing could. That night, I realized parenting wasn't about getting it perfect every time. It was about showing up. It was about making sure my kids knew, in the deepest part of themselves, that they were seen, heard, and loved, especially in the moments when they doubted it most. But raising children while carrying old wounds isn't just about what you give them. It's also about what you learn from them. My children became mirrors, reflecting back the parts of me I had neglected. When they laughed freely, I realized how much I had silenced my own joy. When they asked bold questions, I realized how often I had swallowed mine. When they stood tall, unapologetic in their needs, I realized how often I had shrunk myself. And slowly, almost without noticing, I began to reclaim those parts of me. I laughed louder. I asked questions. I allowed myself to want things without guilt. My children were teaching me as much as I was teaching them. Still, the shadow of my parents lingered. They were still in my life, though distant. They doted on Lily's children the way they once doted on her, showing up to every recital, every birthday, every milestone. My children? They received the same half-hearted attention I had once received. A quick phone call, a last-minute card, sometimes not even that. It stung, watching history repeat itself. Not because I needed my parents to validate me anymore, but because I hated seeing my kids treated unfairly. At first, I tried to shield them from it, making excuses for why their grandparents weren't around. But children are perceptive. One day, my eldest asked, "Why do they like our cousins more than us?" The question hit like a knife. How could I explain favoritism to a child without shattering their innocence? I took a deep breath and said the most honest thing I could. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. They don't always treat people the way they should. But that's not your fault. You are amazing exactly as you are, and their choices don't change that. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was the truth. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough to prevent the cycle from sinking its claws into another generation. Through all of this, I kept journaling. Writing had become my therapy, my anchor. I filled pages with reflections about parenting, about breaking cycles, about the difference between being seen and being invisible. Over time, those journals turned into a kind of roadmap guidelines for the kind of family I wanted to build. One entry I wrote still resonates with me today. A child's greatest need isn't perfection. It isn't gifts or grades or achievements. It's presence. To know someone sees them, truly sees them, every day. If I can give my children that, I've already broken the cycle. Looking back now, I realize that parenting didn't just heal my children, it healed me. By giving them the love I never had, I was, in a way, giving it to my younger self too. Every time I celebrated their drawings, I celebrated the child in me who once hid their artwork in a drawer. Every time I applauded their efforts, I applauded the teenager who once stood alone on a graduation stage. Every time I told them, "I see you," I was whispering it to the invisible child I used to be. And that, perhaps, has been the greatest gift of all. There's a saying I once heard: the child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. For years, I carried that phrase in my heart because it explains so much of my own story. When children are not seen, when their worth is ignored, they find ways, sometimes destructive ways, to demand recognition. Some lash out, some rebel, some fade into silence. I was the last one. I chose invisibility, thinking it was safer. But even silence is a scream when you look closely enough. In my 20s, I thought moving away, building a career, starting a family, would bury that scream forever. And for a while, it did quiet down. But then, every holiday, every phone call, every encounter with my parents unearthed it again. It was always the same: Lily, front and center, me pushed to the side. I'd arrive at family gatherings with stories to share, maybe a promotion at work, maybe my child's milestone, but before I could even finish, the conversation would pivot back to Lily. Her house, her vacations, her children. My words would trail off into the void, unanswered. Each time it happened, I told myself it didn't matter anymore. I had my own family now. I had Daniel, I had my kids, I had friends who saw me, and yet, it still stung. Because no matter how old you get, a part of you still longs for your parents' approval. A part of you still wants to hear, "We're proud of you." That longing haunted me, especially during big life moments. When my second child was born, I called my parents, hoping maybe this time they would sound excited. They congratulated me, of course, but within minutes the conversation shifted to how Lily's kids were adjusting to school. I hung up the phone, sat in the hospital bed, and cried. Not because I needed their validation to love my baby, but because their indifference reminded me, once again, that I would never be the chosen one. For years, I wrestled with the question, should I confront them? Should I finally say out loud, "You hurt me, you've always hurt me, don't you see what you're doing?" But every time I thought about it, fear stopped me. Fear that they would dismiss me. Fear that they would deny everything. Fear that I would be painted as bitter, jealous, ungrateful. Because that's what happens so often in families like mine. The invisible child who speaks up is accused of being the problem. So I stayed quiet. Until one day, my eldest child, now a teenager, asked me something that changed everything. "Why do you let them treat you like that?" The question stopped me cold. I had spent so much time shielding my kids from the truth, trying to soften the blow of favoritism, that I hadn't realized they saw it too. They saw the way my parents dismissed me. They saw the way I swallowed it down. And now they were asking why. In that moment, I realized silence wasn't protecting anyone. It was teaching my children that it was okay to accept neglect, that love should be one-sided, that their worth depended on someone else's recognition. And that was the exact opposite of what I wanted to teach them. So, trembling, I decided to break the silence. The next time I visited my parents, I asked them to sit down. My voice shook, my palms sweated, but I said it. "All my life, I've felt invisible to you. You favored Lily in ways that left me feeling like I didn't matter. And even now, you treat her children differently from mine. I need you to know how deeply that has hurt me." There was silence. Then defensiveness. My father said I was exaggerating, that I was too sensitive. My mother insisted they loved us equally, that I was imagining things. My heart sank. This was exactly what I had feared. But then something unexpected happened. Lily spoke. She looked at them and said, "She's not wrong." The room went still. For the first time, my sister acknowledged the favoritism. She admitted she had felt the difference too, not as the victim, but as the one who received the attention. And though she had enjoyed it as a child, as an adult she could see how unfair it had been. Hearing her say that broke something open inside me. For years, I had doubted my own reality, wondering if I was imagining things, if I was overreacting. But now, my sister's words confirmed it. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't bitter. I was telling the truth. My parents didn't apologize that day. They didn't suddenly change. But for me, that conversation was a turning point. Because I had finally spoken my truth, and it had been witnessed. Not dismissed, not erased, but acknowledged. Walking away from that day, I felt lighter. Not because my parents had validated me, they hadn't, but because I had validated myself. For the first time, I refused to carry the burden of silence. That experience taught me something profound. Healing doesn't always come in the form of reconciliation. Sometimes it comes from releasing the hope that people will change, and choosing instead to stand in your own truth. From then on, I began to approach my family differently. I no longer bent over backwards to earn scraps of attention. I no longer measured my worth by their reactions. I set boundaries. If a gathering left me drained, I left early. If a conversation turned dismissive, I changed the subject or excused myself. And for the first time, I felt in control. Meanwhile, I poured that energy into my children. I told them stories about my past not to make them resent their grandparents, but to help them understand the importance of being seen. I explained why I was so insistent on listening, on celebrating, on making sure each of them felt valued. Because I wanted them to know favoritism wasn't normal, neglect wasn't love, and they deserved better. As I shared these stories, something beautiful happened. My children began to share their own truths more openly. They told me when they felt overlooked, even by me. They held me accountable. And instead of feeling defensive, I felt grateful. Grateful that they trusted me enough to speak. Grateful that they wouldn't carry silence the way I had. Over time, I realized this was the true measure of breaking the cycle. Not perfection, not never making mistakes, but creating a family where truth could be spoken without fear, where invisibility was not the default, where every child knew they mattered. And maybe that's the lesson hidden in all of this. Children don't need perfect parents. They don't need flawless families. They need presence. They need to be seen, to be heard, to know their voice counts. Because the child who is embraced by the village grows into an adult who embraces the world. When I think about resilience, I don't picture someone charging into battle with unshakable confidence. I picture a child quiet, overlooked, carrying wounds no one else sees, who grows up to say, "This ends with me." That, to me, is resilience. Not denying the pain, but using it as fuel to create something better. For a long time, I didn't realize that's what I was doing. I thought I was just surviving. But as the years passed, I began to see the subtle ways my childhood had shaped not only my struggles, but also my strengths. Take empathy, for example. When you grow up invisible, you become acutely aware of what it feels like to be overlooked. That awareness makes you notice others in ways most people don't. At work, I could tell when a colleague's idea was brushed aside. At gatherings, I noticed the quiet person in the corner who no one bothered to talk to, and without even thinking, I would reach out. I would listen. I would draw them into the conversation, because I knew what it was like to sit there, wishing someone would just see you. That empathy became one of my greatest assets, both personally and professionally. It made me a better friend, a better partner, a better parent. And slowly I began to realize that the very thing that had once felt like my greatest weakness, being invisible, had given me a unique strength, the ability to see others clearly. But resilience isn't just about strengths. It's also about the choices you make when faced with old wounds. For me, those choices showed up in how I raised my children. Every day was a balancing act, a test of whether I could truly break the cycle. Some days I passed, other days I stumbled. There was a time when my eldest came home with straight A's, beaming with pride. I praised them enthusiastically, telling them how proud I was. Meanwhile, my younger child, who struggled more in school, stood quietly to the side. I caught the look on their face, a flicker of disappointment, of being left out, and my heart stopped. It was the look I had worn countless times as a child. So I knelt down, looked them in the eyes, and said, "Grades aren't the only thing that matter. I'm proud of you for trying, for working hard, for being kind to your classmates. You are just as important as your sibling." Their face lit up, and in that moment I knew, breaking the cycle wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about noticing them quickly and correcting them. That awareness became my compass. Whenever I caught myself leaning too heavily toward one child, I adjusted. Whenever I felt old patterns creeping in, I paused and realigned. And though it was exhausting at times, it was worth it. Because every adjustment, every correction, was a brick laid in the foundation of a healthier family. Outside of parenting, resilience showed up in how I redefined success. For years, I thought success meant being noticed, finally proving my worth to those who had ignored me. But chasing that kind of validation is a bottomless pit. It never fills you. Through therapy, journaling, and the support of Daniel and my friends, I began to ask a different question. What does success mean to me? not to them. The answer surprised me. Success wasn't about titles or applause. It was about alignment. It was about living in a way that matched my values. It was about creating a home where love wasn't conditional, where truth was spoken, where every person had a seat at the table. Once I embraced that definition, my priorities shifted. I stopped overextending myself at work just to be seen. I still worked hard, but I drew boundaries. I stopped chasing friendships where I was giving everything and receiving nothing. Instead, I invested in relationships that nourished me. And as my circle grew smaller but stronger, I felt something I hadn't felt since childhood: belonging. But here's the part I never expected. My story began to resonate with others. Whenever I opened up even just a little about feeling invisible in my family, people would lean in and whisper, "Me too." It turned out I wasn't alone. There were so many of us children who had been overshadowed, overlooked, or pushed aside in favor of siblings. Children who had grown into adults still carrying those scars. Hearing their stories filled me with both sadness and hope. Sadness, because favoritism and neglect are far more common than most people admit. Hope, because it meant that by sharing our experiences, we could help each other heal. I started writing more openly, not just in my journal but in essays, blogs, even conversations with other parents. I talked about the dangers of favoritism, about the importance of seeing every child, about the long-term scars neglect can leave, and the response was overwhelming. Parents reached out, saying they hadn't realized how their actions might be impacting their children differently. Adults who had been invisible children themselves thanked me for putting words to feelings they had carried silently for years. It was then I understood something vital. Our stories are not just for us. They are for the people who need to hear them, the people who might still be trapped in silence. By speaking up, we don't just heal ourselves, we give others permission to heal too. One day, my eldest asked me why I shared so much of our family history. "Doesn't it embarrass you?" they said. I smiled and shook my head. No, because the truth isn't something to be ashamed of. The truth is what sets us free. That's what resilience had taught me. That strength isn't about burying your story. It's about owning it, shaping it, and using it to light the way forward. And so, step by step, I transformed my invisibility into visibility, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever felt the same way. Forgiveness is one of those words people throw around like it's simple. Just forgive them, they say, as if forgiveness is a light switch you can flick on and off. But when you grow up as the child left in the shadows, forgiveness is complicated. It's tangled in years of longing, in unanswered questions, in wounds that never fully closed. For most of my life, I thought forgiving my parents meant excusing them. It meant saying, "It's okay that you neglected me. It's okay that you favored Lily. It's okay that you made me feel invisible." And I couldn't do that. I couldn't tell myself it was okay, because it wasn't. But what I didn't realize until much later was that forgiveness doesn't mean excusing the pain. It means releasing its grip on you. It means saying, "What you did hurt me, but I will not let it define the rest of my life." And when setting from the chapter, that realization didn't come from my parents. It came from my children. One evening, after a long day, I lost my patience. My youngest had been misbehaving, pushing boundaries, and I snapped. I raised my voice, harsher than I should have. The look on their face, the shock, the hurt, cut me deeper than anything. In that moment, I saw myself in them. I saw the child who had longed for gentleness but received sharpness instead. I sat down beside them, pulled them close, and whispered, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have yelled. You didn't deserve that." They nodded, tears still in their eyes, but slowly their body relaxed in my arms. And it hit me. Forgiveness wasn't about perfection. It was about presence. It was about owning our mistakes, apologizing, and choosing to do better next time. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the moment, I realized something important. If my children could forgive me for slipping up when I admitted it, then maybe I could forgive myself for still carrying my scars. Maybe I could forgive myself for believing the lies planted in me as a child. And maybe, one day, I could even forgive my parents, not to excuse them, but to free myself. So I began the slow, messy process of forgiveness. It started with letters I never sent. I wrote to my mother, to my father, spilling out every hurt, every memory, every longing. I told them how their favoritism shaped me, how their neglect carved holes in my self-worth. And then, at the end of each letter, I wrote the words I had never imagined myself saying, "I release this. I release you. You no longer hold this power over me." I didn't send the letters. I didn't need to. The act of writing them was enough. It was like unclenching a fist I had held tight for decades. Pain poured out, and in its place, space opened for healing. Around the same time, I began sharing more openly with my children about my past. Not every detail, not in a way that burdened them, but in a way that helped them understand why I parented the way I did. I told them about the birthdays where my cake was an afterthought, while my sister's parties were grand celebrations. I told them about the science fair where my spinning planets went unnoticed. I told them about crossing the graduation stage unseen. And then I told them, that's why I make such a big deal about your milestones. That's why I clap the loudest when you show me your drawings. That's why I ask about your day, even when I'm tired. Because I know how much it matters to be seen. Their eyes widened, as if the puzzle pieces finally fit together. And I think, in that moment, they understood me better, not just as their parent, but as a person. Of course, parenting isn't only about what we tell our children. It's also about what we show them. So I tried to model forgiveness in everyday life. When someone cut me off in traffic, instead of fuming, I took a breath. When a friend canceled plans last minute, I didn't spiral into resentment. I showed my kids that forgiveness is a choice, not a weakness. That letting go frees you, not the other person. And slowly, they began to practice it too. But even as I worked on forgiveness, there was another piece of the puzzle I had to face: reconciliation, or the lack of it. Because the truth was, my parents never changed. They never gave me the apology I longed for. They never admitted the depth of their favoritism. They continued to put Lily at the center, even as adults. And for a long time, that broke me. I thought healing wasn't possible without their acknowledgement. But one day, during a conversation with my therapist, she said something that shifted everything. You don't need their apology to heal. You need your own permission. 1. At first, I didn't understand. How could I move on without closure? But then I realized, closure doesn't always come from the people who hurt us. Sometimes, it comes from within. It comes from deciding that their silence will no longer silence you. So I gave myself permission. Permission to grieve the parents I wished I had. Permission to stop chasing their approval. Permission to find closure in my own voice, my own truth. And with that permission, reconciliation stopped being the goal. My parents remained who they were, but I no longer expected them to fill the gaps they had created. Instead, I filled those gaps myself with love from Daniel, with laughter from my children, with friendships that lifted me, with self-compassion I had fought hard to build. For the first time in my life, I felt whole. Not because the scars disappeared, but because I had learned to live fully with them. And here's what I've come to believe. Children who grow up in the shadows carry two choices into adulthood. They can let the shadows define them, or they can use them as contrast to seek the light. I chose the light, not because it was easy, but because I refused to let invisibility be my legacy. There's a quiet power that comes from owning your story. For years, mine felt like a secret I carried in shame. I didn't want to admit that I had been the overlooked child, the one left behind, the one always standing in the shadows of someone else's spotlight. I thought if I spoke it out loud, people would pity me, or worse, dismiss me, just like my parents always did. But something changed when I began sharing pieces of my experience. First with Daniel, then with my children, and eventually with others. Each time I told the truth, the weight lifted just a little more. Each time, someone would nod with tears in their eyes and whisper, "Me too." And that's when I realized my story wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt invisible in their own family. That realization sparked something inside me, a sense of purpose. I couldn't change what had happened to me, but I could use it. I could transform it into a light. For others still stumbling in the dark, it started small. I wrote blog posts about family dynamics, about favoritism, about the silent damage neglect leaves behind. I expected only a handful of people to read them, but the response was overwhelming. Emails poured in from strangers, some from across the world, sharing their own childhoods, their own scars. Some had grown up exactly like me, overshadowed by a golden sibling. Others had different wounds, parents who compared them to cousins, or who ignored them because they didn't fit the family's expectations. But the theme was the same. I felt unseen. I felt like I didn't matter. And with each story I read, I felt less alone. I began to notice patterns. So many of us had grown into adults who either overachieved relentlessly, desperate to prove ourselves, or who shrank into the background, afraid to take up space. Some of us became people pleasers, terrified of rejection. Others became perfectionists, chasing validation that never satisfied. I saw myself in every one of those stories. And slowly, I began responding not as an expert, but as a fellow traveler. I wrote back, "I know what that feels like. Here's what helped me." I shared about therapy, journaling, boundaries, parenting with awareness. I didn't have all the answers, but I had experience. And sometimes, that was enough. Eventually, I was invited to speak at a local parenting group. The topic was raising children with fairness, and I almost said no. Standing in front of people talking about my childhood felt terrifying. What if they judged me? What if they thought I was exaggerating? But then I thought about the child I had been, the one who wished someone had spoken up, who wished someone had said, "This isn't normal, and it isn't okay." So I said yes. I stood in a small community center, my hands shaking, my voice trembling, and I told my story. I talked about favoritism, about the way it seeps into children's hearts, about the scars it leaves long after childhood ends. I talked about the importance of presence, of listening, of making sure every child feels valued. And when I finished, the room was silent. For a moment, I thought I had failed. But then, one by one, parents began to speak. Some admitted they saw themselves in my parents, realizing they had been unintentionally favoring one child. Others admitted they saw themselves in me, the invisible child who grew up feeling less than. Tears were shed, conversations flowed, and in that moment, I understood. This was bigger than me. From then on, I leaned into this purpose. I started volunteering at support groups, helping adults who had grown up with family wounds. I wrote more, spoke more, shared more, and each time, I felt my own scars transform into something powerful. But purpose doesn't erase pain. There were still days when the old wounds throbbed, especially during family gatherings. My parents never changed much. They still put Lily in the spotlight. They still overlooked my children. And though it hurt less than before, it still stung. Yet now, instead of shrinking, I used those moments as fuel. I would return home, hug my children tighter, and remind myself, I am building something different. I am breaking the cycle. One memory in particular stands out. I had just finished giving a talk at a local event when a woman approached me. She looked about my age, her eyes filled with emotion. She said, "I've never told anyone this, but I was the invisible child too. Hearing you speak, it felt like you were telling my story. For the first time, I don't feel so alone." I hugged her. And as I did, I realized that what I once thought was my greatest weakness, my invisibility, had become my greatest gift. Because by naming it, by owning it, I could give others the courage to do the same. That's the thing about pain. It can either close you off or open you up. For years, mine closed me off. But now, it was opening doors to connection, to healing, to purpose. And perhaps most importantly, it was teaching my children a powerful lesson. That wounds don't have to define you. They can refine you. They can become the very thing that equips you to help others. One evening, my eldest asked me, "Mom, do you wish you had grown up differently?" I paused, thinking about the years of longing, the nights of tears, the ache of invisibility. Then I thought about the strength I had built, the empathy I had gained, the purpose I had discovered. Finally, I said, "I wish I had been loved differently, yes. But if I hadn't gone through what I did, I might not be who I am today. And I like who I am today." They smiled, and in their eyes I saw understanding. They saw not just a parent, but a person who had turned pain into purpose. And maybe that's what breaking the cycle truly means. Not erasing the past, but using it to build a better future. Not hiding the scars, but showing how they can become maps to healing. Because in the end, every child deserves to be seen. And every adult who was once invisible deserves to know, your story matters. You matter. Legacy. It's a word I never thought much about as a child. Back then, I was too busy surviving. Too busy trying to understand why love seemed to skip over me and land squarely on my sister. But as I've grown older, as my children have grown into young adults themselves, legacy has become something I think about often. Because the truth is, every family tells a story, sometimes out loud, sometimes in silence. And whether we like it or not, we pass that story down. The story I inherited was one of favoritism, neglect, and silence. A story where one child was treasured, while the other was treated as an afterthought. A story where love was conditional, where attention was scarce, where invisibility was normal. For years, I thought that was the only story available to me. But now I know better. Stories can be rewritten, legacies can be reshaped. The question I ask myself is simple. What story will my children inherit from me? When I look back at the choices I've made as a parent, I see 1,000 small moments where legacy was being written. Moments that might not seem significant at the time, but that will echo in my children's memories for years to come. The bedtime stories I told when I was exhausted, the times I apologized when I messed up, the way I showed up to every performance, every game, every recital, even if I had to rearrange my entire schedule. Those moments are the bricks of our family story. And the more I reflect, the more I realize legacy isn't built in grand gestures. It's built in presence. It's built in the consistency of saying, "I see you, I love you, you matter." But legacy isn't only about what we pass down to our children. It's also about what we carry forward ourselves. For me, that has meant redefining my identity, not as the invisible child, but as the adult who chose to step into the light. That hasn't been easy. Invisibility is a role that becomes comfortable, even when it hurts. It's familiar. Stepping out of it feels like walking onto a stage when you've spent your whole life backstage. I remember the first time I spoke publicly about my story. My voice trembled. My hands shook. Part of me wanted to run and hide, to retreat back into the shadows where it felt safe. But another part of me whispered, This is your moment. You deserve to be seen. And so I stayed. I spoke. And when it was over, people didn't mock me. They didn't dismiss me. They leaned in. They listened. That moment redefined me. It was proof that the role I had been given as a child didn't have to be permanent. I could choose a new one. I could choose visibility. Still, there are days when the old identity tugs at me. Days when I walk into a room and instinctively shrink. When I hear my parents' dismissive voices in my head. When I doubt my worth. But now, instead of letting those moments define me, I treat them as reminders. Reminders of how far I've come. Reminders of the story I'm rewriting. One of the most powerful reminders came from my children themselves. A few months ago, we were sitting around the dinner table, talking about memories. My eldest said, "One thing I'll always remember is how you showed up for us. Even when you were tired, even when you were busy, you always showed up." Tears filled my eyes. Because that was it. That was the legacy I wanted. Not perfection, not grandeur, but presence. The very thing I had longed for as a child, I had given to them. And they noticed. That conversation sparked a realization. Legacy isn't just about what we give, but about what is remembered. Children don't remember every detail. They remember how you made them feel. And if my children remember feeling seen, valued, and loved, then I've already broken the cycle. But legacy extends beyond family too. Over the years, as I've shared my story with others, I've seen how it resonates in ways I never imagined. Teachers have told me they became more mindful of how they treat students, making sure not to play favorites. Parents have told me they started paying closer attention to their quieter children, realizing they might have been unintentionally overlooked. Adults who grew up like me have told me they finally felt validated, finally felt like someone understood. And that, too, is legacy. It's the ripple effect of one story told honestly. Sometimes I wonder what my parents think of all this, if they even know the extent of the impact their choices had. Part of me still longs for them to acknowledge it, to apologize, to see me. But the larger part of me knows I may never get that. And that's okay, because my healing is no longer dependent on their recognition. My legacy isn't tied to their silence. Instead, it's tied to my voice. It's tied to the love I give my children, the empathy I show to others, the truth I speak even when it trembles. There's a phrase I tell myself often now: I am the author of my own story. It reminds me that the script I inherited isn't the one I have to pass down. I can write something new. I can choose a story of fairness, of presence, of unconditional love. And by choosing it, I give my children permission to choose their own stories too. Legacy, I've learned, isn't about erasing the past. It's about building a bridge from it into something better. My past will always be part of me. The invisible child will always live in my memories. But that child no longer defines me. Instead, they guide me. They remind me why I show up, why I listen, why I make sure no one in my family ever feels unseen. And maybe that's the greatest gift of all, that what once broke me has become the reason I build. Family patterns are like rivers. They carve paths through generations, flowing the same way unless someone dares to redirect them. For a long time, the river in my family carried favoritism and neglect. It flowed toward one child, drowning them in attention, while leaving the other thirsty for recognition. That current swept me along for years, but somewhere along the way, I decided to plant my feet and change the course. I didn't fully grasp what that meant until my children grew older. When they were little, breaking the cycle felt simple: show up, listen, love them equally. But as they grew into teenagers, with their own personalities and conflicts, I realized breaking the cycle wasn't just about what I gave them. It was also about what I modeled for them. Because children don't just hear what you say, they watch who you are. I learned this one evening during a heated argument between my kids. The eldest accused the youngest of being the favorite. My stomach dropped. The words echoed like a ghost from my own childhood. For a moment, panic surged through me. Had I failed? Was I repeating the very thing I swore I'd never do? I took a deep breath and did something my parents never did. I invited the conversation. I sat them both down and asked each of them to share how they felt. No interruptions, no dismissals, just listening. My eldest admitted they felt overlooked when I spent extra time helping the youngest with homework. The youngest admitted they felt inadequate compared to the eldest's achievements. I nodded, heart aching but grateful, because here it was, the chance to do differently. I told them, I love you both in unique ways. Sometimes one of you needs more help, and sometimes the other does. But needing help doesn't mean favoritism. Achievement doesn't mean more love. My love is constant, always. They didn't immediately smile and hug, it wasn't a movie scene. But they listened. And over the weeks that followed, I made intentional changes. I carved out one-on-one time with each child. I celebrated their individuality instead of comparing them. And slowly, the tension softened. That night taught me something essential. Breaking the cycle isn't about never being accused of favoritism. It's about creating space for truth. It's about showing your children that their feelings matter, even when they sting to hear. As the years passed, I saw how these choices shaped not only my children, but me. Every time I validated their feelings, I was indirectly validating my own childhood self. Every time I reassured them that love wasn't conditional, I was rewriting the message I once believed. And every time I made space for their voices, I was giving voice to the silenced child I used to be. Healing, I realized, isn't linear. It spirals. You circle back to old wounds at new stages of life, but each time, you face them with more strength, more wisdom. One of the most profound spiral moments came when my eldest left for college. Watching them pack their bags, I felt a rush of emotions. Pride, fear, excitement, grief. I hugged them tight and whispered, "Remember, you matter. You always matter." Tears filled their eyes as they said, "I know, Mom. You've shown me." Now, but a balance of this. That simple response hit me harder than any grand gesture could, because it confirmed something I had prayed for all along. My children didn't grow up invisible. They didn't carry the same ache I once did. They were stepping into the world knowing they mattered. And that, to me, was proof that the river had changed course. But breaking generational cycles isn't just about the children you raise. It's about the family you came from, too. My parents were still alive, still favoring Lily, still unwilling to acknowledge the truth. For a long time, that frustrated me. I wanted them to see the transformation, to admit they had been wrong. But eventually, I realized, expecting them to change was another way of giving them power. So I shifted my focus. Instead of waiting for their recognition, I celebrated my own growth. Instead of seeking their approval, I honored my own choices. And in doing so, I began to notice something unexpected. My relationship with Lily started to shift. For years, I had resented her, not because she asked for favoritism, but because she received it. She had been the symbol of everything I lacked. But as adults, with children of our own, we began to talk honestly. She admitted that being the favorite wasn't always easy either. It came with pressure, with expectations, with resentment from others. For the first time, I saw her not as the golden child, but as another product of our parents' flawed patterns. That realization didn't erase the past, but it softened my anger. Because the truth is, neither of us chose our roles. We were both shaped by the same current, just in different ways. And maybe, just maybe, we both had the chance to change it. We're not best friends now, not some fairy tale reconciliation, but we're allies in a way we never were before. We share stories about parenting, we laugh about childhood memories, and we remind each other to do better for our own kids. And in that, there's healing. Healing across generations is messy. It doesn't mean everyone comes together in harmony. It means you choose to do differently, even when the past pulls at you. It means you teach your children a new way, while still honoring the child you once were. And maybe most importantly, it means you stop waiting for the apology that may never come. Because healing isn't about what they give you, it's about what you give yourself, and what you pass on to the next generation. As I sit here now, years removed from the child I once was, I feel both sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow for the love I never received, gratitude for the strength it gave me to create something new. And I think that's the paradox of breaking cycles. You can hate the pain and still honor the lessons it gave you. Because in the end, that's what family legacy is about. Not perfection, not erasing the past, but rewriting the story, one choice at a time. There was a time when I thought healing meant erasing the past. I believed that if I worked hard enough at therapy, at parenting, at proving myself, I would eventually wake up one day and feel nothing when I thought about my childhood. No sting, no ache, no echo of neglect, just silence. But that isn't healing. Healing isn't forgetting. Healing is remembering differently. When I think about my past now, the memories are still there. The birthdays overshadowed, the graduations overlooked, the countless dinners where my words disappeared into thin air. But instead of cutting me open, those memories remind me of who I chose to become, despite them. They remind me that invisibility doesn't define me anymore. For so long, I equated being seen with external recognition, parents noticing, bosses praising, friends validating. But visibility is not something someone else gives you. It's something you claim for yourself. It's standing tall even when no one claps. It's speaking even when no one listens. It's knowing that your voice, your presence, your story has value, whether others acknowledge it or not. It took me decades to understand that. And when I finally did, it felt like a door opening inside me, a door to freedom. That freedom showed up in unexpected ways. I started trying things I had once been too afraid to do: painting, public speaking, even dancing in the kitchen with my kids. None of it was about being good at it. It was about giving myself permission to exist fully, unapologetically. One evening, my youngest walked in while I was painting a canvas. They tilted their head, studied my brushstrokes, and said, "That's really good, Mom." I laughed. Maybe, maybe not. But you know what? It doesn't matter. I'm not painting to be good. I'm painting because it makes me happy. Thanks of you carried it. They smiled, and in their eyes I saw something powerful, the understanding that joy doesn't have to be earned. It can simply be claimed. And that, I realized, was one of the greatest lessons I could pass on to my children, that their worth is not tied to performance, to comparison, or to someone else's attention. Their worth is inherent. Their worth simply is. This shift also changed how I saw my parents. For years, I avoided family gatherings because I couldn't bear the favoritism, the way they still fussed over Lily while barely acknowledging me. But as I grew stronger, I no longer attended those gatherings with the expectation of being seen. Instead, I went with the intention of being myself. I remember one holiday in particular. The usual pattern played out: Lily in the spotlight, my children overlooked. But this time, I didn't shrink. I didn't swallow my words. I engaged in conversations with extended family, shared stories about my life, celebrated my children's accomplishments aloud. And for the first time, I realized something profound. My parents' neglect did not erase the visibility I created for myself. Walking away from that gathering, I felt lighter. Not because my parents had changed, they hadn't, but because I had. I no longer needed them to see me in order to know I mattered. That realization rippled out into every corner of my life. At work, I stopped over-explaining myself to prove my worth. In friendships, I stopped bending over backward for people who gave little in return. In parenting, I stopped striving for perfection and embraced presence instead. And slowly, I felt a peace I had never known before. It wasn't the peace of a life without pain. It was the peace of a life lived honestly, with scars acknowledged, with truth spoken, with love given freely. I began to understand that my story, while painful, carried a universal truth. Every child deserves to be seen, not because of what they achieve, not because of how they compare, simply because they exist. And when children are not seen, the consequences ripple far beyond childhood. I saw it in the adults who confided in me after my talks, their voices breaking as they admitted they still carried the ache of invisibility decades later. I saw it in the parents who admitted they hadn't realized how easily favoritism slipped into daily life. I saw it in my own children, who thrived when they felt seen and withered when they didn't. That truth became my compass. It guided my parenting, my friendships, my work, my very way of being. And it gave me a sense of mission, to make sure no child in my reach ever felt the way I once did. But there was another truth I had to face. Even if I lived perfectly, even if I gave my children everything I never had, I couldn't protect them from every hurt. Life would wound them in its own ways. Friends might betray them. Teachers might overlook them. Society might fail them. What I could do was equip them. I could teach them that invisibility, neglect, and hurt do not define them. I could show them that healing is possible, that worth is inherent, that visibility is a choice they can make for themselves. And in teaching them, I taught myself. One day, my eldest said something that nearly brought me to tears. We were talking about family legacies, about how patterns get passed down. They looked at me and said, "You broke it, Mom. You broke the cycle." I asked what they meant, and they explained, "You didn't let what happened to you happen to us. You made sure we always knew we mattered. That's what breaking the cycle means." I swallowed hard, tears welling up, because in that moment I realized they were right. I had broken it. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but intentionally, and that was enough. The invisible child I once was would never fully disappear. But now, instead of haunting me, they stood beside me, reminding me why I chose differently, why I fought so hard, why I refused to let invisibility be my legacy. And maybe that's the most powerful ending any story like mine can have, not erasure, but transformation. Not pretending the shadows never existed, but proving that even in the shadows, a light can grow. The more I shared my story, the more I realized something. Invisibility wasn't just my burden, it was everywhere. It was in the quiet student at the back of the classroom whose hand never got called on. It was in the youngest sibling, overshadowed by the eldest's achievements. It was in the colleague whose ideas were always spoken over in meetings. Everywhere I looked, I saw reflections of myself, the child who had once sat silently at the dinner table, wondering if anyone even noticed I was there. And that realization shifted something inside me. Because once you see invisibility, you can't unsee it. I began to notice it at work. During team meetings, I saw how the same voices dominated while others sat back, unheard. Instead of letting it happen, I started saying, "I'd like to hear what you think," turning to the quieter ones. Sometimes their eyes widened in surprise, but when they spoke, their ideas were often some of the best in the room. Later, a colleague told me, "Thanks for noticing me." I didn't think anyone cared what I had to say. I smiled, holding back tears, because I knew exactly what that felt like. I noticed it in my friendships too. Some people only spoke about themselves, rarely asking about me. In the past, I would have tolerated it, thinking my role was to listen endlessly. But now, I started gently pointing it out or pulling back when the imbalance became too heavy. At the same time, I leaned more into relationships that were reciprocal, where my voice mattered just as much as theirs. But the most profound place I noticed invisibility was in children who weren't my own. At the park, I saw a little boy tugging on his parent's sleeve, eager to show a drawing, only to be brushed aside. At a family gathering, I saw a niece trying to share her excitement about a school project, while the adults carried on conversations over her head. And each time, I felt that familiar ache. So I knelt down, listened, asked questions, and celebrated their stories. Their faces lit up, and I thought, this is it. This is how we change things, one moment at a time. Because children don't just need food and shelter. They need to know their voices matter. They need to know they are seen. That's what builds their confidence, their sense of belonging, their belief in themselves. And when they don't get that, they grow up like I did, searching, doubting, aching. I started to see my journey as bigger than breaking cycles in my own family. It became about creating a ripple effect in the community around me. Whenever I spoke at schools or parenting groups, I emphasized this. It's not just about avoiding obvious favoritism. It's about noticing the small moments. It's about making sure no child feels like they are invisible. The response was humbling. Teachers began telling me they were more mindful of praising not just the loud or high-achieving students, but the quieter ones too. Parents said they started scheduling one-on-one time with each child, no matter how hectic life was. Adults who carried their own scars began writing letters to their younger selves, giving them the validation they never received. And every time I heard those stories, I thought, this is what my pain has become. Not a chain, but a key. Not a prison, but a path. Still, even as I poured energy into helping others, I had to remind myself to care for the invisible child still inside me. Because healing doesn't mean you never feel the ache again. It means you recognize it when it comes and tend to it with gentleness. There were nights when the old sadness crept in, nights when I replayed the graduation where my parents' eyes weren't on me, nights when I remembered birthdays that felt like afterthoughts. In the past, I would have drowned in those memories. Now, I acknowledge them. I whispered to that younger version of me, I see you, I hear you, you matter. And with that, the ache softened. It struck me one day that maybe this is what healing across a lifetime looks like. A dialogue between your past self and your present self. The child saying, did I matter? And the adult answering, yes, you always did. And as I practiced that, something extraordinary happened. I started to believe it fully. This belief didn't just stay within me. It flowed into my parenting, my marriage, my friendships. It even flowed into strangers I met along the way. Because once you know the pain of invisibility, you also know the power of visibility. And offering that to others becomes second nature. One story stays with me. After one of my talks, a teenager came up to me. They said quietly, my parents always pay more attention to my brother. I thought it was just me being dramatic. But hearing you, it feels real. It feels like I'm not crazy. I looked at them and said, you are not crazy, and you are not alone. You matter. Don't ever doubt that. Tears filled their eyes, and in that moment, I knew. If my story could help even one child feel seen, it was worth telling. That's the gift of sharing truth. It doesn't just heal you, it plants seeds in others. Seeds of recognition, seeds of hope, seeds of change. And maybe that's what visibility really means. Not standing in the spotlight for applause, but shining a light so others can see themselves more clearly. So now, when I think about legacy, I don't just think about my children. I think about every person who has ever felt invisible. I think about the ripples my story might create, ripples that stretch far beyond me. And I hold on to one simple belief. If each of us chooses to truly see the people around us, our children, our siblings, our colleagues, even strangers, we can build a world where no one has to grow up feeling like I once did. And that, perhaps, is the greatest cycle we can create. A cycle not of invisibility, but of recognition. A cycle where every child, every person, knows in their bones, I matter, I belong, I am seen. As I sit here now, looking back on the long, winding road that brought me here, I realize my story isn't just about being invisible. It's about learning to step into the light. It's about discovering that even when the people who were supposed to see you don't, you still have the power to see yourself. And more than that, you have the power to see others. For so long, I thought my childhood was a curse. I thought being overshadowed by favoritism, being silenced by neglect, was proof that something was wrong with me. But what I see now is that it shaped me in ways I could have never imagined. It gave me empathy. It gave me awareness. It gave me the strength to break cycles that had been running for generations. It wasn't easy. Healing never is. It took years of therapy, of journaling, of late-night tears, and difficult conversations. It took learning to set boundaries, to say no, to walk away from relationships that mirrored the neglect I grew up with. It took countless small acts of courage, raising my voice in meetings, apologizing to my children when I fell short, forgiving myself for the years I spent believing lies. But most of all, it took presence. Presence with myself, presence with my children, presence with the people around me. Because presence is the opposite of invisibility. Presence says, I am here. You are here. We matter. If there's one thing I want anyone listening to take away from my story, it's this. Every child deserves to be seen. Every child deserves to grow up knowing their voice counts. Their existence matters. Their love is not conditional. And if you didn't receive that as a child, you are not doomed. You can give it to yourself. You can build it for your children. You can create it in your community. You can change the story. I used to believe my life was defined by what my parents didn't give me. Now I know it's defined by what I chose to give myself and what I chose to give others. I chose to give recognition where there was none. I chose to give fairness where there had been favoritism. I chose to give love where there had been neglect. And in choosing those things, I reclaimed my voice. Does the ache still surface sometimes? Of course. Healing isn't about erasing the past. There are still moments when I see Lily in the spotlight and feel the shadow tugging at me. There are still moments when my parents' indifference stings. But those moments no longer own me. They no longer define me. They simply remind me of how far I've come. And when those memories rise, I turn to my children. I see the way they carry themselves with confidence, with laughter, with the unshakable knowledge that they are loved. I see the way they speak up when they feel overlooked, unafraid to claim their space. I see the way they lean into each other, knowing their worth is not measured in comparison, but in individuality. That's when I know the cycle is broken. But breaking a cycle isn't just about what ends. It's about what begins. For me, it began with creating a family where voices are heard, where presence is valued, where love is abundant and unconditional. For others, it might begin with telling their story for the first time, or setting a boundary, or looking into a child's eyes and saying, I see you. The truth is, each of us has the power to rewrite the narrative we inherited. The child who was once invisible can become the adult who shines a light for others. The wounds we carry can become maps for healing, not just for ourselves, but for everyone we touch. And that's the legacy I want to leave, not perfection, not wealth, not status. Just the simple, powerful truth. You matter. You are seen. Because if every child heard those words and believed them, the world would look very different. So, to the child I once was, I say, I see you. To the children I am raising, I say, I will never stop seeing you. And to anyone listening who has ever felt invisible, I say, you are not alone. Your story matters. You matter. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to change everything.